Welcome to the Unknown Webcast. We have our friend Holly Pivec joining us again, and she is really aware that I am so conservative I can't turn left even when I'm driving, but she consented to join us anyway. However, I should warn those folks who are joining us for the first time, this is not a safe space for those who may be easily offended by having their ideas challenged. This is broadcast number 98, and this week, Holly Pivec joins us to talk about, will the NAR converge with Evangelical Churches? My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast, and our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie Baby.
Baby, greetings from sunny Florida, where the palm trees came out, saw their shadow, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsors for this webcast include World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies, dubious doctrines, and other ideas whose time has gone. World's End Theology Outlet, and the Designer Jesus Collection. No more do you need to be embarrassed by your church's Jesus. Visit the Designer Jesus Collection at any one of its visiting showrooms at a church near you. And
Designer Jesus Collection.
Designer Jesus Collection, church runways.
That's for those who don't like the church, but they like Jesus. They don't like the Jesus of history, so they can make their own, right?
Well, yeah, they don't like the church, but they like Jesus, but then they don't like your Jesus.
Right.
So,
yeah. So we have persuaded Holly to join us again. There was an article that
against her better judgment.
Against her better judgment, I suspect, but there was an article that kind of caught my attention a few weeks back. Will the NAR converge with Evangelical Churches? They were making a case that they will converge with Evangelical Churches. So I thought, well, I think they might, but maybe Holly, who's way more informed on these things than I am, would have a different answer. So we'll see. And at the same time, there's been some discussions with Michael Brown. Now, I forgot the title of your most recent article. Can you tell us what that is, Holly?
Oh, my response, our response to Michael Brown. Yep. I don't know if I'll remember it now. It was something about responding to Michael Brown's NAR straw man.
Okay.
Is
on the Christian Post?
Right. Is the New Apostolic Reformation just a myth or something more? Something to that effect. I don't know if I have that title exactly right, but that appeared in the Christian Post. Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe we can round it up during one of the breaks or something, so I can let people know about that. Because Michael Brown, it seems, is a defender of the NAR, or at least claiming that there really isn't such a thing as a New Apostolic Reformation. And even if there was, they're really not claiming to be apostles. And even if they were claiming to be apostles, wouldn't be claiming to be inspired apostles. And even if they were claiming to be inspired apostles, they're not claiming new revelation.
Yeah, you lost me right at the beginning. When you said that he says this is where I kind of lost it. You said he claims there is no such thing. I mean, how can, if it has its own Wikipedia page, doesn't that mean it exists?
Well, you know what, if I understand him correctly, he would say that there was a historic New Apostolic Reformation associated with C. Peter Wagner and the organization he led. However, he would say that the term New Apostolic Reformation should not be used today in reference to leaders, churches, organizations, but only in reference to the organization that C. Peter Wagner once led. And he thinks that many critics of the New Apostolic Reformation are claiming that things that the leaders of this movement do not actually teach, such as that the apostles and prophets are claiming to have extraordinary authority and bring crucial new revelation to the church. He would say that this is a misrepresentation of the apostolic leaders today. And so the New Apostolic Reformation, as the critics define it, doesn't really exist, is what he's saying, I think.
But the people are using the name, aren't they?
Right, that's right. So the U.S. Coalition of Apostolic Leaders, which came out of the International Coalition of Apostolic Leaders, they both use the term New Apostolic Reformation very freely. And on their websites, they'll say that they are seeking to usher in a New Apostolic Reformation, and they tie their movement to C. Peter Wagner very clearly. And Michael Brown is actually a council member of the U.S. Coalition of Apostolic Leaders, this organization that does say it is seeking to bring in a new apostolic reformation.
So, okay, so he admits that it exists, but just not as the critics define it, or
that's how I understand what he is saying. It's that they've created a kind of really, he said that the critics have created a conspiracy theory and an Illuminati type conspiracy theory, and it doesn't, what the critics describe does not exist.
okay. And what do you say to that, Holly?
Well, in our book, A New Apostolic Reformation, A Biblical Response to a Worldwide Movement, my co-author, Doug Ivan, and I present a lot of evidence, extensive citations from the apostolic leaders' own literature, which we believe does show that what they're teaching ties to the teachings of C. Peter Wagner and the movement he wrote about and documented. And we believe that we brought forth significant evidence that many of these leaders are claiming that they have extraordinary authority, that they're apostles and prophets who are bringing new crucial revelations that the church must have today. And so, for example, in his latest article, Michael Brown wrote on the Christian Post and then Charisma that Rick Joyner is an example of an apostolic leader today who does not believe these things and extraordinary authority and crucial new revelations. But in his book, The Final Quest, very popular book that Rick Joyner wrote and still promotes and sells, he claims that he received this panoramic vision from God about the end times, and that much of the revelation he received for this vision was at a higher and more accurate level than the New Testament apostles actually received when they wrote scripture. He claims that in the introduction to his book, it was a trance-like state, he said, which is actually, he said the apostles received their revelation in a state where it was more subject to error and bias in their personal opinion, but his revelation was received at a higher, more accurate level. And that's right there in the introduction to his book. And so I'm not The Final Quest, very popular book in the NAR movement. And so I'm not sure how Michael Brown can say that, hold up Rick Joyner as an example of an apostle today who doesn't believe these things.
So he says right in the introduction that his revelation is more reliable than the apostles, than the New Testament.
Right, here's the book. Right, it's right in the introduction. He says much of the revelation he received for this book was received in a trance-like state, which is at a higher, more accurate level than the New Testament apostles probably received their New Testament scripture.
Wow.
So did he do automatic writing or just received it in a translate state and then wrote it down what he remembered? Or does he not tell us any of that?
I can't recall if he addresses that specifically. But in this book, he claims one of the revelations, he claims many revelations that he received, but one is that the Apostle Paul tells him that it's a mistake that people have been reading the Gospels through the lens of the apostles' epistles, through the lens of Paul and the epistles. He says that's backwards. Really, we should be reading the epistles through the lens of Jesus's teachings in the Gospels. And that's a common teaching in the NAR movement. Historically, Protestants would say, no, that we use the apostles as the lens through which we view the Gospels, because they were the authoritative, They were authorized by Jesus to bring those teachings and,
Right.
and to interpret his
Progressive revelation. So you had revelation during Jesus' earthly ministry, and then additional revelations subsequent to that through the apostles.
Well, yeah, and
That's
also
right.
yeah.
And they were authorized as eyewitnesses and as
Right.
authorized interpreters of Jesus's teachings and life and ministry. So that's historically how we would look at the Gospels. But he's reversed that, and a real purpose of that, I think, is it undoes some of the teachings we have in the epistles that would undermine NAR teachings, that we are supposed to be expecting all of these miracles to be occurring today with great frequency. But the thing is, Rick Joyner new revelation that they're presenting is crucial for the church. And there are many other revelations in that book that there's a great end time battle that is coming, and the church must be equipped with miraculous power for this battle, and that his book will play a part in equipping the church with that power.
So the ammo for the battle comes from his book. It doesn't really come from God. That's kind of interesting.
So you know, the question we're looking at today is this starting to make inroads into your regular run-of-the-mill evangelical churches? I mean, I've had the impression that you kind of had to go out of your way to find the New Apostolic Reformation. But are we hearing now that maybe you don't? You might encounter it in your own local church?
Definitely, things have changed. I think you're right. It used to be that you would have to go out of your way more to find these teachings, but they've become fairly mainstreamed within Pentecostal charismatic churches, for sure. And then even outside of Pentecostal charismatic churches, many of the churches, more non-denominational evangelical churches, are playing the music coming out of Jesus Culture or Bethel Redding. But not just the music. You see these churches partnering together in kind of local revival in their cities to bring about revival. And a lot of these times, these efforts are led by the NAR churches in a region. The National Day of Prayer has come under heavy NAR influence. And so often in regions, it's the New Apostolic Reformation churches that are leading up the efforts for the National Day of Prayer in their region. And even at a leadership level nationally, you can see influence from NAR teachings on the National Day of Prayer.
You know, what might help some is if you could kind of enumerate the 7 Mountain Mandate, kind of just a thumbnail definition, because then that kind of helps us to develop some of these organizations that are going into local areas to unite churches to do stuff.
Well, the 7 Mountain Mandate is a very popular revelation in the NAR movement. Many of the apostles and prophets claim God has showed them that the strategy for completing the Great Commission that the church needs is to go into the 7 mountains of society, which I don't know if I'll be able to remember them all, but education, government, media, religion, all these different influential sectors of society that the church needs to go into these areas, and apostles need to rise to the top of those mountains. For example, to become the head of the media institutions, the head of government institutions. And by doing so, then the apostles can go in, they can cast out the high-ranking demonic principalities that are believed to exert rule over those institutions, and they can set up God's kingdom on earth through those institutions. And so that's a very popular strategy that's being pursued today. And you can often see that language of 7 mountains or 7 spheres of society on websites or different outreach efforts. Now some people who use that language might be using it in a more toned down. They're not necessarily part of the NAR. There are missions organizations that use that language that are more mainstream, and they might simply be talking about that it's good for the church to go into these different institutions and try to bring about change. But there's a more NAR amped up version of this revelation that many of the NAR organizations are pursuing. And the problem is you have these organizations working together, the ones that see kind of a more toned down version of this mandate and the ones that see the amped up NAR version. And they're partnering together and equivocating on a terminology. And it's really allowing the NAR teachings to gain inroads into the mainstream, I think, by partnering together with these more mainstream organizations.
Right. I had a call. I relayed this to you. I had a call from a friend in South Florida yesterday about an organization. And his concern, this is kind of interesting. He is very concerned about Roman Catholicism trying to take over and syncretize with evangelical churches. And I think that they have been attempting to do that for a really long time. So, I understand his concern, but they haven't been really effective because generally evangelical churches have had at least some experience with the Bible. So that has sort of protected them a little bit. But as he told me this organization, and I started looking at their webpage, I had sent it to you. I said, this sounds like NAR. This sounds like a sneaky way for NAR churches to bring these churches together, because they're talking about last year we did all this stuff with education. So this year we need to do, so now we have the 7 mountains that they're doing to try to transform culture, to redeem culture. It's interesting language. I just don't find it's biblical language, frankly. So.
Right. And another thing I wanted to mention, Ron, you had asked about if this movement is becoming more mainstreamed. The leaders of the NAR movement are very open and are making concerted effort to legitimatize this movement within broader evangelicalism. And that can be seen, for example, there's a strategy paper that was written by the International Coalition of Apostolic Leaders. And it's titled Defining the Vision of ICAL National Coalitions. And it states that by creating national coalitions, such as the U.S. Coalition of Apostolic Leaders, they're working to legitimatize NAR. And this is a direct quote. This is why it is vital that existing members of ICAL find ways of creating national coalitions in nations, regions, and cities around the world. The AIM strategy can help make this happen as we endeavor to bring legitimacy to the new apostolic reformation. And so they're very open. Again, Joseph Matera recently on Michael Brown's show, Joseph Matera is the head of the U.S. Coalition of Apostolic Leaders. And he said this: I believe that the present embrace of the fivefold ministry of the evangelical pastors in the USA is going to bring a convergence between the charismatic, independent apostolic networks, evangelical networks, and ultimately even evangelical Bible confessing denominations. And so these leaders are very open that what they're seeking is to legitimatize the NAR within broader evangelicalism.
I like the way they said even evangelical Bible. What is it? Bible confessing denomination. Even the ones that believe in the Bible are going to go for this. So really, everybody, all of the aberrant movements try to legitimatize themselves. They try to become mainstream. Mormon missionaries will come to your door and build themselves as a Christian denomination, even though they know that no Christian denomination.
Well, they started doing that in the mid-1970s. Prior to that, they were quite content to say we're the only true church.
Okay.
Right. But then they kind of started doing some good PR stuff to try to be perceived as just another denomination, or maybe a better denomination, more close to what God actually taught, but another denomination anyway, not a separate truth.
Sorry, if I could just correct one thing I just said. The last quote I read, it was by Joseph Matera, but he wrote that in an article titled "The NAR and the Restoration of Apostolic Ministry." He also made another comment on Michael Brown's show, and on April 30th on his Line of Fire show, and that's when he said, "I'm seeing evangelicals embracing the fivefold ministry. I'm seeing the missional church movement begin to use the language of apostolic as prophetic. the line is going to be blurred more and more and more, like it is presently between evangelical and charismatic. That line between apostolic and evangelical is going to be so blurred in 5 or 10 years, they're not going to know who the NAR is.
Do we have any examples of evangelical churches having speakers from the NAR, or people come in or any kind of cooperation between a regular mainstream evangelical church and the NAR? Has that happened noticeably?
Well, I would say more what I've observed is evangelical leaders going to NAR organizations and sharing their platform. For example, Francis Chan has spoken repeatedly at the International House of Prayer on their platform there with Mike Bickle. Ronnie Floyd, former head of the Southern Baptist Convention, has gone and spoken on the platform there at the International House of Prayer. Other mainstream evangelicals will partner together at conferences. I believe that there's an upcoming conference where Ravi Zacharias will actually be speaking and sharing a platform with NAR leaders. I believe it's upcoming or it just recently occurred. And so that's more of what I'm seeing is these very respected mainstream leaders that are going and speaking at conferences, sharing the platform. And then there definitely are instances I'm aware of, for example, I've heard of Calvary Chapel churches where that invited in speakers like Lou Engle to come speak in their churches. So that definitely is happening as well.
Now, for those who are watching and they go, Lou Engle, is that someone I should know? Can you give just another thumbnail? Here's who he is.
Sure. Lou Engle is a well-known prophet in the movement, and he leads call events. The call events are held at large stadiums throughout the United States. They attract thousands of Christians who will come fill the stadium from all different churches in the city, and their billed as kind of unity events where Christians from different churches, denominations come together and pray for revival. What a lot of the Christians don't know, though, who are participating in these events is that NAR teachings undergird these events. So, for example, at one of his recent events in Washington, D.C., there was a huge rally. And at that rally, he had all the women in the audience get down in their birthing positions. And it was a prophetic act to show that they were giving birth to a new Jesus movement. And a prophetic act, for those who don't know, is an act that is actually believed to release creative power. So in the very act of these women getting down into their birthing positions, they were actually giving birth literally to a Jesus movement through that action. And so all kinds of NAR teachings and practices like that were throughout that recent event in Washington, D.C., at that Lou Engle event. And all of the leadership of that event most of the leaders there were NAR leaders, apostles and prophets. But many of the Christians participating had no idea. They thought they were just going to a rally to pray for revival in America.
You're speechless. I've never seen Ron speechless.
I'm speechless. I am without speech. I am birthing positions. I had a question, and I think I forgot what it was. No, actually, I do remember. Why do you said they call them call meetings or call something?
Oh, Lou Engle's organization is named The Call.
Oh, okay.
And so Lou Engle is someone who very openly says that relates his teachings to the Latter Rain movement of the 1940s, which was a precursor to the New Apostolic Reformation. It was a movement where they were trying to restore apostles and prophets to the church, but it was pretty much shut down. The Assemblies of God made an official statement condemning the movement, and it was shut down at that time, kind of went underground, and it's since resurfaced starting in the 80s and the 90s when apostles and prophets started becoming more widely embraced in churches until we have this movement known as the New Apostolic Reformation today.
birthing positions. Okay. Well, okay. Not only that, but just the whole idea that you act something out, and it's a prophetic act that causes something to happen.
Right. It actually releases God's power. And so here's an example of a prophet who is bringing a new strategy to the church that is it's considered crucial for the unfolding of God's end time plans on the earth. Because this new Jesus movement will happen that will bring signs and wonders, which will cause global revival and this great end time harvest that NAR leaders have prophesied, where 1 billion souls will convert to belief in Christ. So all these teachings are tied together.
Please tell me they didn't take any pictures of this.
I believe there are pictures online on different news sites that reported on this.
Well, Ron, it's actually, if you followed much of the Toronto blessing stuff, and after that, this just seems to be like another phase of the same thing. And they were barking like dogs and roaring like lions and getting drunk in the spirit and falling down in the spirit and all that sort of thing. This just seems to be another manifestation of the same kind of stuff.
Did they do their breathing exercises? And I just don't know what to make of this. It's like, it's almost, I guess I find it offensive, and I guess I wonder why they don't, or why, has anyone said that? Has anyone said, boy, this is really over the top. This is really, this is just so bizarre. And yet it's part of apparently a mass movement almost.
It is. Now I have to ask, here's my question. This goes back to the greatest commandment. What was the greatest commandment, guys?
To love the Lord your God
with all your heart,
your mind, soul, and strength.
Mind. It seems, though, that the mind is missing in this manifestation of what we're talking about here. Doctrine seems to be just sort of cast aside and replaced with feelings. I feel this is right, therefore it's from God. But the latter rain movement, a lot of that was William Marion Branham, who was, I know he's popular with word faith teachers and that sort of thing, but he was an absolute heretic. He denied the Trinity. He also gave us a little known guy by the name of Jim Jones. He introduced to the world. So this whole latter rain movement is at best questionable. At worst, absolute heresy.
So is that why they shut it down in the 40s? Not just because of the prophets and things like that, but there was also there were heretical doctrines involved in it.
Yes, I believe that to be true, and definitely the idea of there being offices of apostle and prophet was key in the Assembly of God's condemnation of that movement.
If you're in the latter rain and you're producing apostles and prophets, they've got to be higher up than the denomination heads in your denomination. It was only a matter of time before the apostles and prophets in the latter rain movement started telling the heads of the denominations what to do.
Right. And so recently, Chris Vallotton, who's the prophet at Bethel Church in Reading, working with the apostle Bill Johnson, Chris Vallotton gave a revelation, said God told him that the church needs to begin to gather around apostleships, not denominations, not, denominationalism, but apostleships. And that when the church does that, God will begin to release revelation to the church that's been held in the vaults of heaven for eons of ages.
They're trying to take over. This is a power grab. Yeah.
They'll say they're not. That's what makes it tricky is they'll say that they're not trying to take over, but then there are other very contradictory statements. Recently, Joseph Matera, in one of his articles, he said that this was the article I mentioned earlier, the NAR and the Restoration of Apostolic Ministry. He said one of the implications of this movement is that the church will go from being pastorally led to apostolically led.
So in other words,
doesn't that sound like apostles are in charge?
well, it's like we're not trying to take over. We're just saying follow us instead of your leaders. We're just saying, yeah.
Right. In their same literature, they'll say, you know, we're not trying to take over, that we're there to serve the pastors. We're not there to rule over the pastors.
Okay.
But that seems more like semantics to me.
It'd be kind of like if Kim Jong-un came over here to the United States and said, I'm not trying to take over your country. I'm just saying, do what I say instead of what your president says.
Yeah, it's hard to see how, given their teachings that apostles are supposed to lead, that they're the ones working with prophets who are receiving these new crucial revelations for the church, how they're not in charge.
It's double talk. It's clearly, I mean, if I were a denominational head and I'm hearing, you know, and many denominations, you're just, you know, you're appointed for a period of time. Some denominations will elect a president who will serve a year or two, I don't know, a few years term, and then they'll rotate and things like that. So it's not as though they're holding on to power in many denominations. The power rotates. But if I'm serving as the president of a denomination and I hear, you know, somebody saying that, you know, you should center around us instead of around your denominational leadership, I would take that as a power grab. I would say you're usurping our authority.
Well, and so many, the Assemblies of God has lost many churches to this movement, one being Bethel Church in Redding, California. That was an Assemblies of God church. So that's definitely true. And I wanted to mention as well, you know, Michael Brown, again, his claim that he doesn't know of any apostolic leaders today who claim extraordinary authority. And he says if he did, he would rebuke that person to his face. But I wanted another example I wanted to mention. Bill Haman was recently featured on the cover of magazine, I believe it was the January issue. This is what he claims about the apostles who arise out of this movement. He says their authority will be beyond anything we have seen in our day. And then he says that the time is very soon coming when anyone who comes into the presence of the apostles and prophets with sin in their lives will be struck dead, as were Ananias and Sapphira when they lied to the 12 apostles. And he says that this judgment ministry of the apostles and prophets will cause the church to have great fear and respect for these leaders. And that's from this book, Apostles, Prophets, and the Coming Moves of God. I recommend that people read this book and look at it because the teachings by Bill Haman in here are very startling. He definitely claims an extraordinary authority for these leaders, but he is highly regarded today as one of the most influential apostles and prophets in this movement. He's very respected, endorsed by many charismatic leaders. And again, he compared the authority of these apostles to the 12 when he says that, you know, if people come with sin in their lives and their presence, they'll be struck dead, just as Ananias and Sapphira were when they lied to the 12 apostles. And so again, Michael Brown has been saying that these people do not equate their authority with the authority of the 12, but that certainly seems to be undermined by their teachings.
It's like we're not saying we have the same authority as the apostles, but we have the same authority as the apostles.
Right. You know. All right. Now we're going to do two quick things. One, we're going to have a break, and then we have two comments we want to touch on. So, Ron?
Okay. Well, yeah, let's talk about what our friends at World's End Theology Outlet are saying. They're your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies, dubious doctrines, and other ideas whose time has gone, and they want to know, are you troubled by the existence of countless Christian denominations? Do you tend to think that everyone's judgment is questionable except yours? Do you have a nose for excellent marketing opportunities? Well, the Heterodox Company presents the Do-It-Yourself One True Church Kit. Everything you need to shut untold millions out of God's kingdom. With the One True Church Kit, you get doctrinal options, practical options, your own church history, proselytizing gimmicks, and so much more. You even get your own set of church architectural plans, scores of options to choose from, or building rental options. Notice the following ringing endorsements from people who have used the One True Church do-it-yourself kit. A pastor in Indianapolis says, thanks to the do-it-yourself One True Church kit, my disciples are so narrow they can look through a keyhole with both eyes. A pope in Phoenix says, it's a great product. I've never had my ring kissed so many times. And a church in Philadelphia says, go away. Now that we're the One True Church, we don't waste our time with spiritual peasants like you. The do-it-yourself One True Church kit. Everything you need to know to shut untold millions out of God's kingdom from World's End Theology Outlet.
The One True Church
Well,
kit.
we've got to get Holly to New Orleans next year to do a presentation. This is scary stuff. It's kind of chilling to hear something.
Well, it is. Now, Mr. E asked in regards to the topic, would not James chapter 4 sum up the softening and filtration of biblical Christian institutions, placation, and whatnot? I don't know. There's so much in the New Testament about false teachers, false prophets, guarding the flock, that seems to be overlooked by much of the church. I would just go and say, Jesus talks about those who would come to you and claim to be a prophet, Matthew 7:15 and following, to beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. By their fruits you shall know them. The fruits are not good works. The fruits are their prophecies. Are they true or are they false? It's a very simple question. Give them a T, true, give them an F, false. If they get one F, kick them out. That's it.
Yeah.
And Kim Treeweek, who does some wonderful research for us, loves working with her. She writes that encounter evangelism is used with the young adults and teens by passing, thinking, and getting to the emotions in a stadium with lots of energy and contemporary Christian music, such as Bethel music.
Tell me about Bethel music. What is that?
So Bethel music, the music that their leaders produce there, and the group Jesus Culture that also came out of Bethel Church, they produce some of the most popular music today that's played on Christian radio. It hits, top of the charts, the music charts, sung in churches throughout the nation, even conservative Baptist churches. This is the most popular music today, and it is produced out of Bethel Church in Reading there. The most popular church today in the New Apostolic Reformation.
Any songs I might recognize? What's
Probably not. You're old.
I'm old. Well, sometimes I accidentally turn on Christian radio.
And so I like to tell people, this music isn't saying, follow the apostles and prophets, submit to the apostles and prophets. Though it doesn't have those kind of lyrics. But it does have overtones of NAR teachings, emphasis on the miraculous and things like that. But I think the real danger with this music is people are liking the music and then are being drawn to the teachings of Bethel Church and the NAR through the music. And so I think that's a real danger.
Right, because you hear the music, you like the music, it makes you feel spiritual, it's very emotive. And so when you feel spiritual, then you look and say, well, how can anything bad come out of a church that produces this kind of music? It must be spirit-led. And when you start asking doctrinal questions, at least what happens to me when I start asking doctrinal questions is they look at me like I have two heads.
Like, do you have an example of that? What kind of doctrinal, just about any doctrinal question puts them off, and it's like, what do we do? Why are you wasting my time talking about this?
Yeah, pretty much. You're just being divisive. You're being narrow-minded. You're being, nitpicky. And unfortunately, though, I find that scriptures are almost by definition nitpicky. You can hardly go to one of the epistles and not find Paul or Peter is correcting some false doctrine that has infiltrated the church.
Plus, if you're criticizing somebody for not being loving, you're criticizing them for not following the New Testament doctrine on love. It's a teaching. They're all teachings. They're all important. So what you're really doing is you're just saying some teachings are more important than others. The ones you like are more important than than the ones that I'm
Well, and
asking
sometimes
questions
it's a
about.
matter of definition. If you said, okay, you're not acting loving, well, is the loving thing to look the other way if someone is doing injury to themselves?
Love rejoices in the truth. Is this true? The stuff that you're talking about.
Okay, yeah. So you just made a leap. Love rejoices in the truth. That's true. This is true doesn't necessarily follow that, though.
Well, no, I mean, if are you rejoicing in the truth? In other words, I'm trying to establish whether you're following the truth or error.
Right.
So in other words, if you're rejoicing in error, that's a problem.
Right. Correct.
Yeah.
And it would be unloving to not point that out.
Right.
In a loving way. I mean, we don't have to be mean-spirited about it. I mean, I like being mean-spirited about it. It gives me great pleasure sometimes.
It's more fun.
And another interesting thing about the music that a lot of people might not realize is, how we were talking earlier about prophetic acts, and just by virtue of engaging in the act, you're actually creating a reality. Well, that undergirds the music, because within this movement, when you declare these words repetitively over and over and over again about bringing God's kingdom to earth, or these kind of things, you're actually creating reality with your words. So it's a different way of viewing worship music than you would view it in more traditional evangelical churches. And so that's something that people sometimes miss is when the people in these churches are singing this music, they actually believe they're creating this reality with their words.
Okay. So they have integrated or used as a stepping stone word faith theology.
Definitely.
Where faith is a force, words are the containers of that force, and you speak into reality that which you desire.
Definitely. So word of faith teachings, they would view as a restored truth. That is one of the truths that the church lost through the centuries. It's now been restored. And so the NAR would say that there are many truths that have been restored: the truths of the prosperity gospel, the word of faith teachings, the truths of spiritual gifts, at Azusa Street, that these are all various restored truths, and they incorporate all of these under their NAR framework.
So is the repetitiveness, the repetitive nature of the music, does that reflect their doctrine? They think that the repetition is significant, or is that just coincidental?
I think they think they're creating an environment to actually bring God's presence in their midst as they're singing. They're inviting him. His presence is there, and then when his presence is there, they will receive revelation. They will experience miraculous power or healing. So they're trying to create an environment that's conducive to inviting God's presence and seeing the manifestation of the miraculous.
Okay.
So this is maybe off topic, and you may not be prepared for this, but I guess too bad. This is a question I like to play with. It happens to be in my wheelhouse, let's say. Wicca is the idea that you can cause the universe to conform to your will through spoken spell and incantation. Word faith theology, it seems to me, is the idea that you can cause the universe to conform to your will by spoken word and incantation. Isn't that true?
I do. I think there are definite similarities with New Age and occult.
And this has been pointed out to Kenneth Copeland, who then says even witches get this right to some degree. And so what you're really having then is you're teaching Christians to perform witchcraft using Christian terminology. That's really what you're doing.
Yes, I think that there are definite similarities there. But in fact, the leaders of the NAR movement, many of them will say that the New Age and the occult stole these practices from Christians. That these practices were, known by the early church and embraced. That the church lost these practices and therefore is restoring them. And so, actually, the New Age and the occult do get some things right that the church at large has missed. And so the similarities are there.
You know what?
So we lost those practices, like when we lost the missing books of the Bible that we don't really have anymore.
Yeah. You know, one of the things you deal with when you try to talk to people who are involved in this is that they come back and they say, "But I've been so blessed by it," or you know, it's they can talk about maybe healings that they've had or miraculous things they thought happened in their lives, or just they talk about their experiences and things like that. How can you get across to somebody like that the dangers of these teachings when you're trying to, or can you, or do you have to wait until they become disillusioned?
Right. I mean, it can be hard. I think pointing them to Scripture, to evaluate all their experiences on the basis of Scripture. And I find that it's helpful to point out that other religions that they would agree are false religions, that people in those religions also have experiences. For example, Mormons claim, to have a burning in the bosom that validates the truth of Mormon teaching, or even people in other, Eastern religions, and they all claim to have experiences that validate to them the truth of their religion. So we can't just go by experience. That can be deceiving.
Okay. So
Infiltrating the church, it seems to be that this is already in process. I think we're sort of agreed on that. There's a kind of a movement up in Wausau, Wisconsin, that seems to have real connections to the NAR, and they are using the music from the NAR, and trying to create a sort of a driving force to change culture, to bring them into the church through a whole variety of crusades and that sort of thing. How much of that sort of thing are you seeing, or are you not seeing that yet?
You're speaking of the drive to change culture through crusades, and
Yep.
So within the NAR movement, there's a definite emphasis on bringing God's kingdom to earth, His physical kingdom, through the transformation of culture, through the 7 Mountain Mandate we talked earlier, and definitely unity rallies are being held in cities and towns throughout the nation, throughout the world, where Christians across denominations are being urged to join together and pray for revival. But as I mentioned before, just like the concept of worship or prophetic acts, prayer in this movement is often viewed as you're creating reality through your prayer, through your declarations and proclamations. And so at these unity events, Christians are gathering, praying that God's kingdom will come to earth, engaging in various prophetic acts and practices in order to do that. So that's huge. That's definite.
So
Definitely.
if prayer is an act of creation, where does God fit in to prayer? What's His role in prayer?
Right. They would say that God that's how God designed, that's how God intended for the church to partner with Him to bring His kingdom to earth through authorizing them through their proclamations and declarations to create reality. So that's the church's role, that He has authorized them in all of this.
So we should no longer take prayer requests. We should take prayer proclamations.
Right. They would say there are 2 types of prayer. Peter Wagner says 2 types of prayer. There are petitions, and then there's this other type of prayer where you actually declare and proclaim and create reality. And he would see that second one is a higher form of prayer that the church is supposed, or a form of prayer that the church is supposed to be taking up today.
Did he ever supply a biblical example of this?
Yeah, I believe one example he gave, we talk about this in our book, A New Apostolic Reformation, and in one of the appendices there. But I think Moses is one example he gives. He says Moses just declared, made declarations and the miracles happened. So that's a biblical precedent for making declarations that create reality.
But are they called prayers? I always thought those were something other than prayers when Moses did those things.
Yeah, that's one way he explains that. We go again into more detail in our book about those teachings, but yeah.
How did Moses? I'm confused. How did Moses create reality?
Good question. He, in fact, when he hit the rock with the stick and the water gushed out, he actually was rebuked by God because it was God providing the water.
Right.
But he said, "Must we now get water from this rock for you?" As if it was him doing it. And he was told just to speak to the rock, and he hit it.
So here's an example from the book. This is what I'm talking about. This is Peter Wagner saying, a case in point is Moses on the banks of the Red Sea. And the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward, but lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea." That's in Exodus 14. God told Moses specifically that intercession, crying to me, would not do it in this case. An apostolic decree was necessary.
Wow. It seems we have decreed Ron gone.
And then he goes on to say that proclamation, not petition, was used in every instance of raising the dead in the New Testament. He concludes that this may indicate that the higher the level of prayer, the more that proclamation rather than petition is called for.
I kind of missed some of that. I accidentally hit a button and lost you guys.
Yeah, we noticed that.
So I was hitting the microphone button so I could cough, and I hit the
exit.
I hit something else.
So
so Moses is told to not to cry to God, but rather to stretch out his rod.
Stretch out his rod and tell the children of Israel to cross.
Right.
And the Red Sea divided. Now,
which is another way of saying, don't pray to me, but do this other thing.
Issue an apostolic decree, basically. Yes.
Okay, but it's still not prayer. It's in other words.
And this isn't really even an apostolic decree. He's following what God told him to do.
Right.
He's not commanding God to do anything or to even change reality. God said, "Here's what I want you to do." Either he said okay, or he disobeyed, like in the case of the striking the rock. But it was always God doing it, and he had in advance told him what he was going to do.
So they would say this is what the church in these end times needs to be doing. It needs to be issuing these decrees and proclamations that will bring God's kingdom to earth. And this is under the authority of the apostles and prophets, who are authorized to make these types of decrees and proclamations.
Okay, and we are to believe that they were authorized based on what? Their claim?
Good question.
Yeah. I've heard others make similar kinds of claims, and I have to go, okay, but why should I believe you? I explained to you earlier, we're looking at a cult in South Africa right now. And their claim is that the leader had special circumstances in his life which confirmed to him that he's called of God to raise up the one true church. Because, of course, all of the church is now in apostasy, and that we become a new species, a Christ species. But I go, but why should I believe you? On what basis? Just because you give me examples that you claim are miraculous in your life, I find no biblical precedence that is what we are to look for. We have a biblical outline of how we know true teachers from false teachers, and this ain't it. You got to turn your mic back on.
Peter Wagner made a statement at a conference once. I was trying to look it up. He said he made a disparaging remark about theology. I forget what the exact remark was. And he said, and that is a church growth principle. Something like, theology gets in the way of church growth. You have to ignore theology if you want to grow your church. Something like that. I don't remember exactly what he said. And then there was a pause, and he says, "Yeah, and that is a church growth principle." And I hear he got laughter for that. So here is Wagner disparaging theology. And then he turns around and everything he's doing here is he's making his own theology. He's redefining prayer. That's a theological act.
Right.
He's telling us that apostles and prophets need to make a comeback. That's a theological declaration. He is practicing theology after telling us to stop doing it, or don't do it too much, or theology can get in the way of church growth. Then he turns around and starts
developing a theology, right?
And not only that, but just totally. I'm sorry, I don't see a connection with Scripture. I don't see, and I get the impression I really wasn't following his career toward the end of his life. I remember back in the 80s getting some of his books, and to me he was just one author among many, although he was kind of like the pioneer of the church growth movement. And that I didn't realize that later he was pioneering this whole new deal, this new apostolic reformation deal, probably until after he died. But he goes off on this tangent, and he is claiming all of this authority. It seems to me that what he did was he got people to stop thinking about theology, and then he replaced it with his own brand.
Theology, right.
Which is a classic.
We're getting close to the end here. Ron, I'd like to do a quick Designer Jesus, and then a couple of comments, and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
Oh, well, okay. Well, let's
take good care of the time that Holly committed to us.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about that. Do you cringe when the Christians you hang out with try to introduce Jesus to your non-Christian friends? Well, you can say goodbye to the days when your church's Jesus was a source of social embarrassment. Now, even your church can keep pace with the latest fashion-forward trends in spirituality. Introducing the Designer Jesus Collection. These amazing new Jesus styles are hitting church runways in the most exclusive Jesus fashion shows at churches near you. You don't want to miss Yoga Jesus, Hipster Jesus, Buddy Jesus, Socialist Jesus, Mormon Jesus, and of course, Muslim Jesus. At Designer Jesus Collection fashion shows, you will find a Jesus you'll be proud to introduce to your most sophisticated, cutting-edge friends and acquaintances. Please observe the attendance requirements. The cost of admission is your eternal soul. Required attire, semi-formal. All proceeds benefit His Royal Majesty, the Kingdom of Darkness. The Designer Jesus Collection. London, Paris, Rome, New York, Salt Lake City.
And there you have it.
It is.
So, Holly, if someone wanted to, do you have a web page they can go to if they want to see what you're up to?
Sure. Right. So my blog is Spirit of Error, www.spiritofterror.org. And I update there pretty frequently. And just in conclusion, I wanted to point out that many of the apostolic leaders today are attempting to distance themselves from C. Peter Wagner. They would say that they disagreed with some of his teachings and are trying to distance themselves. But what we show in our book is that the teachings of C. Peter Wagner, the apostolic leaders today do teach very much very similar things that C. Peter Wagner taught, and they may have little differences here and there, but by and large, they're teaching very similar things to what he was teaching. And so it's important for people to realize that when these leaders attempt to distance themselves from C. Peter Wagner, that actually they are promoting the governing offices of apostle and prophet, that those are crucial offices that must govern the church today and bring their crucial new revelations so God's kingdom can be set up on earth. These are all teachings that are in line with what Wagner taught.
And which of your books goes through this? So that
this is A New Apostolic Reformation, a biblical response to a worldwide movement. And that goes into the greatest detail. We have a shorter book called God's Super Apostles, which is for people who just want the quick read, the crash
down and dirty,
course.
right?
And that also has a study guide to go with it, which people have been using in their churches and in groups to warn groups about this movement and educate them.
No, it's really important. You're doing a great job with that, and I appreciate you.
How could you find out if the NAR is in your area somewhere? Is there a telltale sign? Are there, is there an NAR website that shows where there's
right? No,
where
because it's not a single organization, and so there's not. But clues you can look for is if a church is promoting people who are claiming to be apostles and prophets that are, if they use the term fivefold ministry, that often refers to the belief that there are governing apostles and prophets today, not just church planners, not just people with the gift of prophecy, but these are apostles and prophets who claim to govern the church and have extraordinary authority. And those are things to look out for. And of course, if they're promoting the teachings of Bill Johnson or Cindy Jacobs or Mike Bickle, or these influential NAR leaders, that's always can be a clue too to look out for.
The best place I think to go first would be your website, though, spiritofera.org, right?
Right. I think people will, once they look through some articles there, they'll start to see what to look for.
Okay.
Right. All right, Ron, you want to walk us out of here?
Oh, yes. Thanks for the reminder. Okay. I have to get that set up, don't I? Well, let's do that here.
Let's do
we
that
need
here.
Credit where credit is due. And so thank you, Holly, for being with us. And I am already thinking of things we can talk about with you again the next time. Hope that's okay with you. Yes, our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D Opposer. Our Mormon archives manager is Polygamous. Our liberal denominations bureau chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender bureau issues coverage comes from Ben Hur, our special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys. Oh, dehumanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yoleg Pulling. Technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Our grievance resolutions director is Ivana Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is Wiretapping. And original idea sourcing comes from Drew LeBlanc. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, which are solely responsible for its content, but you will never, ever, ever, ever be able to prove that in a court of law.
Never, because we have great attorneys, Dewey, Cheatham,
and Howe will be on your case. So,
all right. Thank you so much, Holly, and we will have you back in the future, and then you will really know you've been had.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.